Picture this: the salty tang of the sea air, the clamor of haggling merchants, and the creak of ships laden with spices, furs, and exotic treasures. This was the soundscape of Europe's bustling medieval ports, where fortunes were made and empires quietly took shape. Among these chaotic trading hubs, something extraordinary was brewing, a network so powerful it would rewrite the rules of commerce and politics for centuries. But here's the twist: it wasn't a kingdom with an army or a single ruler with grand ambitions. It was a league of merchants, the Hanseatic League. How did this alliance of traders, born from humble beginnings, come to dominate European trade with an invisible hand? The answer lies in a story of cunning, cooperation, and a secret web of influence that stretched from London to Novgorod. At its peak, the Hanseatic League wasn't just a business association, it was a shadow empire. Its members didn't wear crowns or wield swords, yet they commanded more power than many kings. They built cities from nothing, dictated trade policies to nations, and even sparked wars without ever raising a banner. But perhaps the most fascinating part: no one knows exactly how it started. The League's origins are shrouded in mystery, lost to time like a faded merchant's ledger. Was it born from a desperate pact between a handful of ship captains, a clever scheme to outwit greedy nobles, or something even more surprising? This is the tale of how a loose alliance of traders defied the odds, bending the medieval world to their will. Over the next minutes, we'll unravel the secrets of their rise, how they turned backroom deals into unbreakable monopolies, how their ports became fortresses of wealth, and why their legacy still echoes in the global trade networks we know today. Stick around, because this isn't just history. It's a masterclass in power, strategy, and the art of building an empire without ever drawing a sword. The Hanseatic League didn't just move goods, it moved the world, and you're about to see how. To understand how the Hanseatic League rose from obscurity, we need to step into the fractured world of 12th century Northern Europe. Picture a landscape still reeling from the age of Viking raids, coastal towns vulnerable, trade routes unpredictable, and merchants constantly looking over their shoulders. It was an era of chaos and opportunity, where bandits and rival lords could swoop in at any moment to seize cargo or demand extortionate tolls. For German traders navigating this volatile environment, survival meant sticking together. The spark came in 1143 with the founding of Lübeck, a scrappy new port on the Baltic coast. This wasn't just another trading post, it was a deliberate experiment in safety through unity. Lübeck's merchants, tired of being picked off by pirates or bankrupted by arbitrary taxes, began forming mutual protection pacts. They pooled resources to guard shipments, negotiated bulk discounts on tolls, and even funded their own lighthouses to keep routes open year-round. What started as informal handshake deals slowly hardened into something revolutionary. A structured alliance where members swore oaths not just to profit but to defend one another. But here's where it gets fascinating. Unlike feudal lords who ruled by birthright or guilds bound by a single craft, this coalition crossed borders and industries. A cloth trader from Lübeck might team up with a herring merchant from Hamburg or a fur dealer from Bremen, creating a web of interdependence that made them collectively unstoppable. When storms wrecked a member's ships, others would front loans to rebuild. If a foreign ruler threatened one, the entire network would boycott his ports, a medieval version of economic sanctions. This wasn't just business, it was a quiet rebellion against the feudal order, proving that money could be as powerful as swords. The real genius, though, lay in their adaptability. While kingdoms rose and fell, the League evolved like a living organism. New cities joined not by conquest but by cold calculation, recognizing that membership meant access to safer routes, better prices, and a slice of this growing invisible empire. By the time anyone in power noticed their influence, it was too late. The Hanseatic League had already rewritten the rules, turning ad hoc alliances into an engine of wealth that would dominate trade for centuries to come. Lübeck wasn't just another stop on the medieval trade map. It was the beating heart of the Hanseatic League, a city so vital that its seal became the unofficial emblem of the entire network. Nestled between the Baltic and North Seas, Lübeck's location was no accident. Imagine a natural crossroads where salt from Lüneburg met furs from Scandinavia, where timber from Prussia flowed westward to fuel Europe's growing cities, and where Flemish cloth headed east to dress the elites of Novgorod. This wasn't just geography, it was a merchant's dream, a choke point controlling the flow of wealth across half a continent. The city's rise began in 1143 when Count Adolf II of Holstein granted it special privileges, effectively making it a free imperial city. That meant no local lord could arbitrarily tax its merchants or interfere with their deals, a radical concept in an age where nobles squeezed traders like grapes. Lübeck's council, dominated by shrewd merchant families, used this freedom to craft laws that favored commerce. They standardized weights and measures, established courts to settle disputes fairly, and even pioneered early insurance systems to protect shipments. Word spread fast. Here was a place where money talked louder than titles and ambition trumped birthright. But Lübeck's real masterstroke was how it exported its model. As other towns saw its success, they clamored to join the network, adopting what became known as Lübeck law. This wasn't just a legal code, it was a franchise blueprint for prosperity. Cities from Riga to Bergen copied its urban layout, with wide market squares, fortified warehouses called staple yards, and guild halls where merchants could strike deals under the League's protection. Even Lübeck's signature red brick Gothic architecture became a status symbol, a visual shorthand for Hanseatic wealth. The League's leadership didn't crown a king or elect a president. Instead, they met in Lübeck's towering Marienkirche, debating policy under vaulted ceilings that seemed to bless their ventures. Decisions were made by consensus, but make no mistake, Lübeck's voice carried the most weight. When the League needed to flex its muscles, boycotting Norway's king for raising tariffs, or besieging a Danish castle that threatened their ships, it was often Lübeck's coffers that bankrolled the operation. The city became so synonymous with Hanseatic power that outsiders began calling the whole network the Lübeckers League. Yet what's most striking is how Lübeck's influence outlasted the League itself. Centuries after its decline, the city's archives still hold thousands of sealed contracts, their wax insignias a silent testament to deals that shaped economies. Modern shipping lanes still trace routes Lübeck's captains pioneered, and the very idea of a trade bloc, like the European Union, owes a quiet debt to this medieval experiment. Lübeck wasn't just a city, it was the prototype for a new kind of power, one built on ledgers rather than land, and on trust as much as treasure. The Baltic and North Seas were the medieval equivalent of superhighways, not paved with asphalt, but with shifting currents and treacherous winds that only the boldest sailors dared navigate. These waters weren't just barriers between lands, they were liquid marketplaces where fortunes floated on every wave. Salt from Lüneburg's mines, packed into barrels and shipped north, preserved the herring that fed half of Europe. Timber from Prussia's vast forest sailed west to build the growing cities of Flanders and England. Furs from Novgorod, so dense and luxurious they became status symbols, traveled south to warm the elites of Germany and France. This was trade in its rawest form, where survival depended on timing the seasons, shipping herring before it spoiled, moving timber before winter froze the ports, and delivering furs when nobles stocked up for cold months ahead. But these routes weren't plotted on maps by kings or generals. They were carved out by anonymous merchants who memorized the quirks of each harbor, where the shallow waters of Bruges demanded flat-bottomed cogs, or how the icy approaches to Bergen required reinforced hulls. The real currency wasn't just silver coins, it was knowledge. A skipper from Rostock might know that sailing 2 days after the spring equinox meant catching favorable winds to London, or that bribing a Danish harbour master with an extra barrel of salt could shave a week off customs delays. These weren't just trade secrets, they were lifelines in an era where a single storm or pirate raid could erase a year's profits. What made these exchanges revolutionary wasn't the goods themselves, but the systems that grew around them. In Visby on Gotland Island, German traders established a clearinghouse where deals could be brokered without carrying bulky cargo, an early form of futures trading. At the Scanian herring markets, temporary cities of booths and tents sprang up each autumn, with standardized measures ensuring a basket of fish in one stall equaled a basket in another. This wasn't just commerce, it was the birth of trust networks that transcended language barriers. A merchant from Bremen might not understand a word of Estonian, but he knew the Hanseatic stamp on a bale of flax guaranteed its quality. The League's true innovation was turning these ad hoc routes into a regulated web. They established staples, designated ports where goods had to be unloaded and offered for sale, preventing price crashes from oversupply. They negotiated safe conducts with Scandinavian kings, paying annual fees in silver to exempt their ships from Viking-style raids. Most crucially, they built a relay system of lighthouses and marker buoys maintained by local guilds that turned perilous journeys into predictable supply chains. Where once a trip from Riga to Bruges might take 3 months with endless detours, Hanseatic captains could now make it in 6 weeks, a medieval miracle of logistics. Yet the routes also hid darker stories. The same ships carrying amber and wax might transport enslaved people from the east, sold in markets from Novgorod to Lisbon. Timber shipped to England often came from forests where indigenous Baltic tribes were pushed off their lands. The League's records speak of conflict goods, loot from border wars between Teutonic knights and Lithuanian princes, quietly laundered into the legal trade. This wasn't just a network of exchange, it was a mirror of medieval Europe's complexities where profit and power bled together. By the late 1300s, these routes had matured into something unprecedented. A merchant in Gdansk could order cloth from Bruges, pay with silver mined in Saxony, and ensure the shipment through a Lübeck banker, all without leaving his counting house. The seas that once divided nations now bound them together in a web of mutual dependence. Salt-preserved fish that fed miners who dug ore that minted coins that bought furs that. The cycle fed on itself, growing richer with each revolution. What began as risky voyages between a few ports had become the circulatory system of Northern Europe's economy, pulsing with the rhythm of the tides. And at the center of it all, pulling the strings, stood the Hanseatic League, not with swords, but with ledgers, tides, and an unshakable understanding that whoever controlled the routes controlled the world. The island of Gotland, a windswept slab of limestone in the Baltic Sea, might seem an unlikely birthplace for a commercial revolution. But here, in the shadow of Visby's towering city walls, German merchants stumbled upon a formula that would change history. Picture a 13th-century trading post where dialects collided: Saxon haggling with Swedes, Livonian traders bartering with Danes, all under the watchful eye of local Gotlanders who'd mastered the art of taking a cut from every deal. This chaotic bazaar became the petri dish for Hanseatic cooperation, proving that shared rules could turn rivals into allies. The breakthrough came with the Visby Agreement of 1261, a document so mundane in wording yet seismic in impact. Unlike flashy royal charters dripping with wax seals, this was a practical contract scribbled by merchants for merchants. Its genius lay in simplicity. German traders pledged to resolve disputes through impartial juries rather than fistfights on the docks, to standardize the quality of goods like wax and fur, and most radically, to pool their ships for convoy protection. Suddenly, a Prussian merchant no longer needed to bribe pirate chiefs for safe passage. He could join a Hanseatic flotilla where 30 crossbowmen stood guard on the lead cog. Visby's true innovation wasn't just the rules themselves, but how they were enforced. The agreement created a common chest, a shared fund filled with silver pennies where every member contributed based on cargo value. Fines for cheating went into this chest, funding public goods like harbor dredging or bribes to troublesome Norse chieftains. It was medieval crowdfunding with teeth: cheat your partners and you'd be banned from the next herring season. The message was clear: trust wasn't optional, it was baked into the profit margins. What made Gotland's experiment work was its hybrid nature. The island remained technically under Swedish crown control, yet German merchants carved out extraterritorial rights. Their warehouses became sovereign soil where Lübeck law trumped local edicts. When a drunken brawl between a Dane and a German turned deadly in 1288, the killers weren't tried by Swedish courts but by a merchant tribunal. This legal twilight zone became the blueprint for later Hanseatic enclaves from London Steelyard to Novgorod's Peterhof. The island's physical layout tells the story. Archaeologists still find layers of crushed amber in Visby's soil, evidence of the amber tax, where traders had to spill a handful from each sack to fund city walls. These very walls, built with merchant silver, weren't just defensive, they were psychological branding, announcing that here commerce ruled. Even the churches doubled as secure vaults. The altar of St. Mary's held not just relics but iron-bound chests of silver ingots. Yet Gotland's golden age carried the seeds of its own obsolescence. As direct routes between Lübeck and Novgorod opened in the 1300s, the island became a scenic detour rather than a vital hub. The last Hanseatic meeting in Visby in 1361 ended with merchants voting to shift their headquarters to Lübeck, a symbolic passing of the torch. But the DNA of those early agreements lived on. The common chest principle evolved into the League's war treasury. The convoy system became their naval strategy. And that radical idea, that competitors could thrive by cooperating, became the quiet revolution that built an empire without borders. The road to Novgorod was paved with honey and blood, a 1,000-mile gauntlet through dense forests where wolves howled and bandits lurked. Yet for the merchants of the Hanseatic League, this was the golden path to fortunes untold. At its end stood Peterhof, their walled enclave inside Russia's greatest trading city, where the air hung thick with the scent of beeswax and the rustle of sable pelts. Here, in this alien world of onion domes and birch bark scrolls, German traders mastered a delicate dance, bringing the West silver to feed the voracious mints of Russian princes, while funneling the East luxury goods back to Europe's hungry elites. Novgorod wasn't just another stop on the Hanseatic network, it was the edge of the known world. Unlike Lübeck or Bruges, where Latin script and familiar laws ruled, this was a land of Cyrillic contracts and capricious boyars. The League's solution, Peterhof, a self-contained German microcosm within the city. Behind its wooden palisade, merchants lived under Lübeck law, drank beer from Baltic kegs, and even buried their dead in consecrated ground brought from home. The compound had its own jail, scales with officially approved weights, and a chapel where deals were sealed on relics smuggled from Westphalia. To Novgorod Slavic traders, it must have seemed like a piece of Europe had washed ashore intact. The goods exchanged here transformed both continents. Each spring, when the frozen rivers cracked open, Novgorod's markets exploded with activity. Russian trappers brought bundles of black fox furs so dense they could stop and arrow luxuries that would eventually trim the robes of Burgundian dukes. Beekeepers hauled honeycombs the size of wagon wheels, their wax destined for cathedral candles across Christendom. In return, Hanseatic carts disgorged ingots of silver mined from Saxony's depths, crucial for minting the coins that fueled Russia's growing economy. But the most controversial cargo, weapons, fine Frankish swords, Flemish crossbow bolts, and sometimes even armor, tools that strengthened Novgorod against Mongol raids but also armed their wars against fellow Russians. Trade in Peterhof followed rituals stranger than any Hanseatic port. deals were struck not in writing but through kissing the cross, swearing oaths on a crucifix while gripping a lump of wax. Account books were kept not on parchment but on birch bark strips that could be tossed into a fire if inspectors came. The annual St. Peter's Day settlement saw debts reconciled in a drunken festival where German and Russian merchants finally spoke the same language, the clink of silver and the splash of kvass. Yet tensions simmered beneath the honeyed surface. In 1386, Novgorod's mob stormed Peterhof after rumors spread of German merchants cornering the grain market during a famine. 40 Hanseatics died in what became known as the Night of the Broken Scales. The League responded with a trade embargo so severe, Novgorod's churches ran out of wax for candles within months. It took 3 years of negotiations and a small mountain of ermine pelts as reparations before the gates reopened. What made this eastern outpost endure wasn't just profit but mutual desperation. Novgorod needed European silver to pay tribute to Mongol overlords. The League craved Russian goods no other Europeans could reliably supply. Their symbiosis birthed innovations that shaped global trade. Standardized fur rubles, bundles of pelts tied to specific silver values, triplicate contracts in Greek, Slavic, and Latin, even primitive letters of credit honored from Novgorod to Lisbon. By the time Ivan III annexed Novgorod in 1478, the Hanseatic presence was already waning, but Peterhof's legacy lived on in the trade routes it solidified paths that would later carry not just furs and silver, but the cultural DNA of East and West. The wax that sealed Novgorod's deals eventually sealed Luther's the seas. The silver that once bought sable funded Muscovy's rise. And deep in Lübeck's archives, you can still find birch bark fragments, ghostly receipts for a time when an alliance of merchants built bridges where empires saw only walls. Bruges was the Wild West of Hanseatic trade, a city where Flemish weavers, Italian bankers, and German merchants collided in a dizzying whirl of commerce. Unlike the orderly streets of Lübeck or the frozen outpost of Novgorod, this was a place where rules bent and fortunes flipped overnight. The League's base here wasn't just another contour, it was a fortress of hustle, a sprawling complex called the Oosterlingen where the scent of damp wool mingled with the tang of North Sea salt. And at the heart of it all, cloth. Not just any cloth, but the finest woolen textiles in Europe, luxuries so coveted that a single bolt could buy a peasant's plot of land. The Flemish had mastered the alchemy of turning English sheep's wool into gold. Their looms produced fabrics with dyes so vivid they made Venetian silks look dull crimson from madder roots, royal purple from crushed mollusks, deep blacks using iron-rich swamp mud. For the Hanseatics, controlling this trade wasn't just profitable, it was existential. Their ships arriving from the Baltic carried cargoes of timber, wax, and furs, but without Flemish cloth to sell eastward, the entire economic engine stalled. That's why the League fought tooth and nail to secure privileges in Bruges, even as local guilds seethed at their presence. The contour system here operated like a medieval free trade zone. German merchants lived under their own laws, paid taxes in bulk silver rather than petty tariffs, and even had the right to judge their own in special courts. This state within a state infuriated Flemish weavers who saw the Hanseatics as parasites skimming profits from their labor. Tensions erupted in 1380 when mobs torched the Oosterlingen after rumors spread of Germans hoarding grain. The League's response was brutal, a 6-year embargo that left Bruges canals choked with unsold cloth, its markets silent. Only when the city council groveled, offering reparations and restoring Hanseatic privileges, did the ships return. What made Bruges unique was its role as a clearinghouse for Europe's luxuries. A single Hanseatic cog might arrive with Russian furs, then load up with Flemish cloth for Norway, pick up Norwegian timber for England, and finally carry English wool back to Bruges, a 4-way cycle of profit. The contour's ledgers revealed deals stretching from Iceland to Jerusalem. amber beads traded for Spanish saffron, Livonian flax swapped for Sicilian almonds. This wasn't just trade, it was alchemy turning variety into wealth. Yet the League's grip on Bruges carried the seeds of its undoing. By the 1400s, silting canals and political shifts redirected commerce to Antwerp. The contours walls, once buzzing with polyglot haggling, grew eerily quiet. But for nearly 2 centuries, Bruges had been the crucible where Hanseatic pragmatism met European ambition, proving that even in a world of kings and knights, those who controlled the cloth could dress an empire. The Steelyard wasn't just a trading post, it was a slice of Germany carved into the heart of medieval London. Tucked between the Thames and the stinking alleyways of Dowgate, this walled compound pulsed with an energy entirely its own. Imagine iron-barred gates swinging open at dawn to reveal courtyards stacked with Prussian timber, warehouses reeking of salted herring, and clerks scribbling in Low German as they tallied debts in silver marks. To Londoners, it was an alien enclave where merchants in fur-trimmed robes paid no local taxes, judged their own lawsuits, and drank Rhenish wine from cellars deeper than the king's. What made the Steelyard extraordinary were the privileges stamped into royal charters. Starting with Henry III in 1237, English kings granted the Hanseatics rights no native merchant could dream of: exemption from tolls on wool exports, permission to sell Baltic goods directly from their wharves, even the right to bear arms within city walls. In return, the League provided something England desperately needed: stability. When domestic wool markets fluctuated, Hanseatic ships kept the flow steady. When rebel lords blockaded London in 1471, it was Steelyard merchants who smuggled in grain through secret river channels, but the real power lay in their monopolies. Walk into any English marketplace in the 1400s, and the finest goods bore the League's invisible stamp, that beeswax candle lighting a cathedral altar. Shipped from Novgorod via the Steelyard, the iron nails holding a nobleman's roof together, smelted in Sweden and sold through Hanseatic factors. Even the king's own table relied on their networks: Prussian rye for royal bread, Baltic amber for court jewelers, and the Steelyard's legendary beer, brewed under special dispensation since London's water was too foul to drink. The compound itself was a marvel of medieval logistics. Its central crane, operated by a treadmill powered by convict labor, could hoist 3-ton barrels straight from ships' holds. Underground tunnels linked warehouses to the river, allowing goods to move unseen during political unrest. Most ingenious were the sample rooms, chambers where buyers could inspect everything from Danzig oak to Russian hemp without leaving the premises, a concept later copied by the London Stock Exchange. Yet this fortress of commerce bred resentment. English merchants grumbled about Hanseatic Steelyard weights, bronze measures allegedly rigged to skim extra silver. In 1493, mobs stormed the gates shouting "Germany out," after rumors spread of merchants hoarding grain during a famine. The League's response was characteristically ruthless. They embargoed English cloth exports to the Baltic for 4 years, bankrupting half of East Anglia's wool towns until the Crown renewed their privileges. What finally undid the Steelyard wasn't rebellion, but shifting tides of power. As Tudor England built its own merchant fleet, and the Hanseatic League's influence waned, the enclave shrank from a powerhouse to a relic. When Elizabeth I revoked its privileges in 1598, most warehouses stood empty. But walk the Thames today near Cannon Street Station, and the cobbles still dip where Hanseatic carts once rolled, ghostly ruts marking where Europe's first multinational corporation staked its claim on English soil. The Hanseatic League didn't just trade goods, it traded in power, wielding embargoes like a medieval nuclear option. Picture this: Norway's king, Erik Magnusson, waking in 1284 to find his harbors eerily silent. No creaking cogs unloading grain, no merchants haggling over dried fish, just empty quays and mounting panic. This was no act of war by a rival kingdom, but a calculated squeeze by an alliance of merchants. The League had declared a full trade blockade, cutting off Norway's lifeline of Baltic grain and Flemish cloth until the king rolled back his new tariffs. Within months, with bread prices soaring and nobles muttering about rebellion, Eric caved. The Hanseatics didn't just win lower duties, they proved a radical idea that commerce could bend crowns to its will. What made their diplomacy so effective wasn't just brute economic force, but a sophisticated playbook refined over centuries. The League's leadership, a rotating council of burgomasters from key cities, operated like a shadow cabinet. When negotiating with kings, they spoke with one voice, presenting demands backed by sworn oaths from dozens of member cities. A single parchment might bear the seals of Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and Riga, creating a unified front that feudal lords couldn't divide and conquer. Their threats carried weight because everyone knew when the Hanseatics promised an embargo, they could enforce it. Their network of ports from Gdansk to Bruges meant they could reroute trade overnight, leaving rebellious rulers isolated. The Norway blockade was just one move in a larger strategy. In 1370, when Danish King Valdemar IV seized Hanseatic ships, the League responded by funding a rebel claimant to his throne, then bankrolled a pirate fleet to ravage Danish coasts. After 2 years of economic warfare, Valdemar surrendered not just trading rights, but strategic castles controlling the Øresund Strait. These weren't just business deals, they were geopolitical coups disguised as mercantile disputes. The League even maintained a war chest in Lübeck's Marienkirche, filled with silver marks earmarked for bribes, mercenaries, and when necessary, outright piracy. Yet their genius lay in knowing when to switch from stick to carrot. In England, where anti-Hanseatic sentiment ran high, they cleverly positioned themselves as solution makers. During the Great Famine of 1315, when English merchants hoarded grain, it was Hanseatic ships that broke the shortage, earning them enduring tax breaks. In Bruges, they averted expulsion by financing the city's canal expansion, literally cementing their place in local infrastructure. This duality, ruthless enforcers one moment, indispensable partners the next, kept rivals perpetually off balance. The League's most enduring diplomatic innovation was the Congress system. Unlike feudal parliaments or royal courts, their meetings held in Lübeck's salt-stained guild halls functioned like early trade summits. Delegates debated not by birthright but by cargo volume. A Riga fur trader might outvote a minor noble. Resolutions passed not by force but through complex consensus building. When the Teutonic Knights demanded military aid against Lithuania in 1410, the League didn't refuse outright. They imposed conditions, guaranteed amber monopolies, toll exemptions, and a say in castle placements. Even warlords had to haggle with these merchants. By the 1400s, Hanseatic diplomacy had grown so sophisticated that kings began mimicking their methods. The Danish sound dues tolls on passing ships were essentially a royal copy of Hanseatic staple policies. Burgundian dukes adopted their contract templates for Antwerp's markets. Even the Holy Roman Emperor borrowed their embargo tactics in disputes with Italian city-states. The League's greatest legacy wasn't just the wealth it amassed, but the blueprint it left for how economic power could reshape the world, proving that sometimes a ledger could be mightier than a legion. The Baltic Sea in the late 1400s wasn't just a trade route. It was a battleground where the Hanseatic League faced its most unpredictable enemy, pirates with royal backing. Enter the Victual Brothers, a ragtag fleet of mercenaries turned sea wolves, who began as privateers hired by Swedish rebels during a succession war. But when the war ended, these men didn't disband. They kept their ships, their weapons, and their taste for plunder, morphing into a floating kingdom of chaos. Their name, Victual Brothers, sounded almost noble, hinting at their original mission to supply blockaded cities. But by the 1390s, they'd become the terror of the north, sacking Bergen, burning Lübeck's outskirts, and even holding entire coastal villages for ransom. What made them so dangerous wasn't just their brutality, but their connections. These weren't lone wolves, they operated with tacit support from Scandinavian nobles who resented Hanseatic dominance. Some victual brothers carried letters of marque from rival kings, blurring the line between piracy and warfare. Their stronghold on Gotland, the same island where the League's early agreements were forged, became a twisted mirror of Hanseatic cooperation, a democracy of desperados where captains voted on targets and split loot according to strict, if unlawful, codes. The crisis reached its peak in 1401 when the League's patience snapped. Hamburg, the city most battered by their raids, funded a special fleet under Simon of Utrecht, a captain whose blend of naval genius and ruthlessness matched the pirates' own. His secret weapon, a revolutionary new ship design Lena, faster vessels with swivel guns that could outmaneuver the brothers' bulky cogs. The showdown came off Heligoland, where Utrecht's fleet cornered the infamous Klaus Störtebeker, the brothers' charismatic leader. Legend claims Störtebeker's ship was disabled by a traitor who poured molten lead into its rudder, a fittingly mercantile betrayal for an enemy built on stolen trade. Störtebeker's capture and execution in Hamburg became the stuff of dark legend. As he faced the executioner's axe, he supposedly bargained for his crew's lives with one last request, that any man his headless body walked past would be spared. The decapitated pirate allegedly stumbled past 11 men before the executioner tripped him, a tale likely embellished, but one that underscores the mythic status these outlaws achieved. The crackdown that followed was as much about messaging as justice. Hamburg displayed the pirates' severed heads on spikes along the Elbe, a grisly warning to any who'd challenge Hanseatic order. But the League also learned a strategic lesson. You couldn't just hang your way out of piracy. They established permanent patrols, the first coordinated anti-piracy force in Europe, and strong-armed Scandinavian kings into revoking all letters of marque. Most crucially, they invested in faster ships and deeper harbors, making trade routes harder to ambush. Yet the Victual Brothers' legacy lingered. Their raids had exposed the League's vulnerability, not just to swords, but to the shifting loyalties of feudal lords who saw piracy as a handy weapon against merchant power. The crackdown solidified Hamburg's rise as a naval power, but it also marked a turning point. The League could no longer rely solely on economic clout. It needed swords as sharp as its ledgers. In the end, the pirates didn't just steal cargo, they stole the illusion that commerce could ever be separate from the messy realities of power. Beneath the ledger books and guild seals, the Hanseatic League hid a dirty little secret: it could wage war with the ferocity of any kingdom. The myth of the peace-loving merchants crumbled in 1361, when Danish King Valdemar Atterdag made a fatal miscalculation. Eyeing the rich Hanseatic port of Visby, he invaded Gotland with a professional army, slaughtering German traders and seizing their warehouses. To Valdemar, it must have seemed like easy plunder. These were just merchants, after all, without knights or castles. But the League's response proved how dangerously he'd underestimated them. Within weeks, Lübeck's council did something unprecedented. They voted to raise a mercenary army. Not just a few hired swords, but a full-fledged invasion force funded by a war chest drawn from 37 member cities. Hamburg mortgaged its guild halls to finance warships. Riga melted down church silver to buy crossbows. By spring 1362, the Hanseatic fleet, 100 cogs retrofitted with castle-like fighting platforms, descended on Denmark like a storm. They didn't just attack military targets, they burned fishing villages, blockaded grain shipments, and even sacked Copenhagen itself. For merchants supposedly allergic to violence, they fought with chilling efficiency. The war's turning point came at the Battle of Helsingborg in 1362, where Hanseatic archers and dismounted knights faced Valdemar's cavalry. Chronicles describe German merchants fighting in formation under banners bearing not coats of arms but symbols of their trades, a crossed herring and barrel for Lübeck, a wool bale for Hamburg. When the Danes charged, they broke against a wall of pikemen funded by fur profits. The victory wasn't just military, it shattered the feudal belief that commerce and warfare couldn't mix. But the League's true weapon was endurance. While kingdoms depended on seasonal campaigns, the Hanseatic cities kept pouring silver into the war year after year. By 1367, with Denmark's economy collapsing under embargoes, Valdemar's own nobles turned against him. The resulting Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 wasn't just peace, it was a mercantile coup. The League extracted concessions no military power had ever won: control of key Danish castles for 15 years, veto power over royal succession, and a staggering 2/3 share of Øresund toll revenues. Overnight, the Sound, Europe's most vital waterway, became a Hanseatic toll booth. What made this victory remarkable wasn't just its scale, but its aftermath. Unlike kings who sought land or titles, the League cared only about trade mechanics. They returned the captured castles once the terms expired, asking not for glory but for guaranteed docking rights. Their war records in Lübeck's archives read like business ledgers, column after column of expenses for crossbowmen, stone shot, and beer for hired men, each entry meticulously balanced against projected toll income. This wasn't war for conquest, it was war as leverage, fought with the same cold calculation as a cargo auction. Yet the Danish conflict exposed a paradox. The League could assemble armies faster than most kingdoms, but it hated prolonged campaigns. Every year of war meant lost trading seasons. Their solution: a standing naval force, the first of its kind. By the 1400s, they maintained peace cogs, warships disguised as merchant vessels, ready to intercept pirates or blockade ports at a council's vote. It was defense by other means, proving that merchant princes understood deterrence long before nuclear states. The lesson echoed across Europe's courts: cross these traders and they wouldn't just bankrupt you, they'd outfight you. When the Teutonic Knights tested Hanseatic resolve in 1410, they found their grain shipments halted and their credit frozen in Bruges. Even the mighty English crown tread carefully after witnessing Denmark's fate. For all its ledgers and laws, the League's most potent export was fear, the quiet understanding that behind every merchant's smile lay the sharpened pikes of a very unconventional army. The mighty Hanseatic cog wasn't just a ship, it was a floating fortress of commerce, its rounded hull bulging with enough cargo to feed cities. Picture these vessels as the 18-wheelers of the medieval seas, their distinctive flat bottoms allowing them to settle comfortably on tidal mudflats when harbors were scarce. Built from sturdy oak planks with a single square sail towering like a castle keep, a typical cog could carry up to 200 tons, enough salt to preserve every herring in Scandinavia, or enough grain to fill a king's granary for winter. What set them apart wasn't just brute capacity, but clever adaptations honed through generations of Baltic sailing. The stern-mounted rudder, a recent innovation in the 1200s, gave them maneuverability that older steering oars couldn't match. Their clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks sealed with wool and tar, flexed with the waves rather than fighting them, allowing these workhorses to weather northern gales that shattered sleeker Mediterranean galleys. But the true genius lay in standardization. Walk the docks of any Hanseatic port from Bruges to Reval, and you'd find cogs built to nearly identical specifications. Masts stepped at precisely 18 paces from the bow, hulls measuring 60 feet with a 20-foot beam. Even the ropes followed universal thickness guidelines, allowing repairs with borrowed rigging anywhere along the trade network. This wasn't just convenience, it was strategic brilliance. A skipper from Stralsund could take command of a Rostock-built cog and know every plank and pulley instantly. When storms damaged ships in distant ports, local Hanseatic carpenters had the templates to rebuild them without waiting months for instructions from home. The convoy system turned these dependable ships into an unstoppable force. Each spring, as ice retreated from Baltic harbors, Hanseatic captains gathered in Lübeck's Trav estuary for the Skippergesprech, the Sailors' Council. Here, veterans shared updated charts showing sandbar shifts, while younger skippers learned secret routes through the Danish straits. They'd then form flotillas of 30 or more cogs, sailing in tight formation with armed escorts at front and rear. These weren't just defensive measures against pirates, they allowed collective bargaining at every stop. A lone merchant might pay whatever toll a Danish castle demanded, but a Hanseatic convoy could threaten to bypass a port entirely, starving it of trade until terms improved. What really left competitors in the wake was the League's obsession with turnaround times. While Venetian merchants might lounge for weeks awaiting full cargo loads, Hanseatic cogs operated with brutal efficiency. Dock crews in cities like Danzig worked shifts around the clock, using standardized barrels that could be rolled from warehouse to hold in minutes. The League even pioneered primitive containerization, wool packed in identical bales, herring in uniform barrels allowing ships to be loaded blindfolded if necessary. Records from 1420 show a Hamburg cog unloading wax and flax in London, taking on English wool and departing within 53 hours, a speed that left foreign merchants gaping. Yet the fleet's greatest advantage was invisibility. Unlike flashy Mediterranean galleys with their colorful banners, Hanseatic cogs flew simple pennants, if any at all. Their captains kept logs in coded merchant script, noting tides and winds but never precious cargo manifests that might tempt pirates. The ships themselves were deliberately plain, their hulls coated in dull tar rather than showy paint. To outside observers, they were just slow, ugly tubs until those tubs began outcompeting every rival through sheer reliability. While English merchants lost fortunes to ships wrecked with single-hull construction, and Dutch flights rotted from green timber, Hanseatic cogs kept sailing year after year, their oak timbers toughened by Baltic winters. The ultimate testament to their design came in unexpected places. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 1300s, it was these unglamorous cogs that kept supply chains alive, their crews following strict quarantine protocols. When the Teutonic Knights needed to transport siege engines to Lithuania, they commissioned Hanseatic shipwrights to modify cogs into floating battering rams. Even in decline, the legacy endured. The cog's basic blueprint evolved into the mighty carracks that would later carry Columbus and da Gama. For 3 centuries, these humble ships had been the silent arteries of an invisible empire, proving that in the calculus of power, reliability could outweigh grandeur every time. The Hanseatic League didn't just move goods, it reinvented the very language of money. While kings still counted wealth in chests of silver coins, these merchants were quietly building the scaffolding of modern finance. Take the humble bill of exchange, a scrap of parchment that revolutionized trade. Picture a fur trader in Novgorod needing to pay a Flemish weaver for cloth, but carrying sacks of silver across bandit-infested roads was suicide. Instead, he'd visit a Hanseatic counting house and scribble a promise, a bill redeemable for silver in Bruges. That slip of paper could change hands a dozen times before being cashed, lubricating deals across thousands of miles without a single coin leaving Lübeck's vaults. What seemed like simple credit was actually a financial time machine, letting merchants spend profits they hadn't yet earned. But with risk came innovation, especially in maritime insurance. A single storm could wipe out a year's profits, so Hanseatic guilds developed pooled risk systems centuries before Lloyd's of London. Before a fleet sailed, merchants would gather in smoky taverns, haggling over percentages. A skipper insuring his herring cargo for 20 marks might pay 2 marks into a common pot. If his ship sank, the fund covered his loss. If it arrived safely, his coins stayed to cover others. This wasn't charity, it was cold calculation. By spreading risk across hundreds of shipments, even disastrous years became survivable. The League's ledgers from 1424 show something astonishing. Over 70% of voyages were insured, a rate unmatched until the 18th century. Then there were the weights, those unassuming brass scales in every contour that became the League's silent weapon. In an era when every town had its own measures, Hanseatic merchants imposed ruthless standardization. A last of grain was always 12 barrels. A ship-pound of wax equaled 320 exact grams. These weren't suggestions, they were enforced with fines and expulsion. The genius lay in predictability. A merchant in Bergen could order 100 ship-pounds of iron from Gdansk sight unseen, knowing it would match his molds perfectly. This reliability became their trademark, so much that non-Hanseatic traders began demanding Hans measure as a seal of quality. The League's most cunning financial trick, though, was invisible, double-entry bookkeeping. While Italian banks often get credit, Hanseatic warehouses were using debit and credit columns decades before Medici accountants popularized the system. Their Skatteböcker tax ledgers show meticulous records tracking everything from herring taxes to toll bribes. Every transaction listed twice, creating an inescapable web of accountability. When a Lübeck shipmaster claimed pirates stole his cargo in 1405, the League's books proved he'd never paid the insurance premium, a paper trail that saved his partners from ruin. Yet these innovations had a dark edge. Standardization crushed smaller competitors who couldn't afford certified weights. Insurance pools favored established merchants over newcomers. Even bills of exchange became tools of control. The League's contours could freeze a trader's credit lines overnight for violating rules. What began as practical solutions hardened into monopolistic strangleholds, proving that financial innovation could be as potent as any fortress or fleet. The real surprise, these systems outlasted the League itself, seeping into European commerce until the world forgot they were ever Hanseatic inventions. The coins rusted away, but the ideas, those kept sailing on. The Hanseatic League may have been forged in the fires of commerce, but its true legacy lies in something far less tangible, the invisible currents of culture it carried across Europe. Beneath the cargo holds of those lumbering cogs, alongside barrels of herring and bales of wool, sailed ideas that would reshape the continent. Nowhere is this more striking than in architecture. Walk through the old towns of Tallinn, Wismar, or Stralsund, and you'll find the same red brick Gothic cathedrals, guild halls, and stepped gabled warehouses, a visual signature as recognizable as any merchant seal. This wasn't coincidence, it was deliberate cultural engineering. When Lübeck's merchants rebuilt their city after a devastating fire in 1251, they pioneered a style blending North German austerity with French Gothic flair, thick walls for Baltic winters, soaring vaults to impress visitors, and those distinctive green-coppered spires visible for miles at sea. As new cities joined the League, they didn't just adopt trade rules. They imported Lübeck's masons and bricklayers, creating a unified aesthetic that screamed Hanseatic prosperity from Riga to Bergen. Yet architecture was just the most visible export. The real revolution came in the form of Lübeck law, a legal framework so effective that over 100 cities from Poland to Norway scrapped their local customs to adopt it. Unlike feudal codes that favored noble whims, Lübeck's statutes were merchant-written and merchant-friendly. They standardized everything from inheritance rules protecting widows' shares in family businesses to dockyard protocols fining captains who left debris in harbors. In Danzig, adopting Lübeck law in 1343 meant replacing Slavic customary law with German-style jury trials. In Stockholm, it forced Swedish nobles to accept that a burgher's debt contract outranked aristocratic privilege. This legal virus spread through the League's network with astonishing speed because it worked. Disputes that once took years to resolve now settled in months, attracting more traders and more wealth to compliant cities. Then there were the unintended cultural hitchhikers, small innovations that traveled along trade routes. The League's obsession with record-keeping popularized paper usage in regions still clinging to parchment. Their need for precise timekeeping brought mechanical clocks from England to Prussia decades before royal courts adopted them. Even dietary habits shifted. Baltic cities developed a taste for Flemish beer, while Londoners suddenly craved Rival's smoked sprats. The League's ships carried not just goods but entire lifestyles, like the Dutch herring gutting technique that transformed Scandinavian fishing, or the Rhenish practice of aging wine in oak barrels that revolutionized Baltic brewing. Perhaps most surprisingly, the Hanseatic network became an accidental information superhighway. When the Black Death struck in 1347, it was Hanseatic captains who first brought news of the plague's westward march, along with futile quarantine measures copied from Italian ports. A century later, when church reformers in Hamburg embraced Luther's teachings in 1521, it was Hanseatic couriers who smuggled his pamphlets to Livonia in wool bales. The same ships that carried Russian furs to Flanders, often returned with Flemish art altarpieces painted in Bruges, found their way to Finnish chapels within months, introducing Nordic worshippers to Renaissance styles before Rome itself fully embraced them. This cultural bleed wasn't always peaceful. When the League insisted member cities adopt Low German as their official business language, it marginalized local tongues like Estonian and Old Prussian. Their standardization of weights and measures erased centuries-old regional systems. Even something as mundane as the League's preferred brick size, 28 centimeters long, became a quiet tool of cultural domination. Local kilns that couldn't match the standard went bankrupt. Yet for all its coercion, the Hanseatic cultural exchange laid foundations we still walk upon today. Modern maritime insurance clauses trace back to Lübeck's 14th century contracts. The concept of a free city immune to feudal dues inspired later republics, and those red brick Gothic buildings, they've outlasted empires, still standing as monuments to an era when trade routes didn't just move goods, they moved minds. The writing was on the birchbark scrolls long before the axe fell on Novgorod's Peterhof. By the late 1400s, the Hanseatic contour there had become a shadow of its former self, its warehouses half empty, its merchant rolls thinning with each passing season. Ivan III of Moscow, a ruler who'd spent his life methodically swallowing up Russian principalities, viewed the enclave with growing suspicion. To him, these foreign merchants weren't just traders. They were a rogue state within his borders, operating under German laws, worshipping in Latin chapels, and answering not to Moscow but to some distant council in Lübeck. When the final blow came in 1494, the pretext was almost laughable. A few Hanseatic merchants allegedly cheated in a fur deal, but the real reason. Ivan had outgrown his need for middlemen. The closure wasn't some sudden royal tantrum, it was the culmination of decades of shifting power. Moscow's rise as a centralized state meant Russian merchants no longer needed Hanseatic ships to reach Europe. New overland routes through Smolensk and Lithuania bypassed Novgorod entirely, while Dvina River traders began dealing directly with English and Dutch vessels in the White Sea. Most damningly, Ivan had built his own answer to the Hanseatic system, a state-controlled trading post called the Gostiny Dvor, where Russian goods could be sold without German tariffs or meddling. When he padlocked Peterhof's gates and expelled its merchants, he wasn't just ending a partnership, he was declaring economic independence. For the League, losing Novgorod wasn't just about lost profits, it shattered their entire eastern strategy. The contour had been their gateway to the Eurasian fur trade, where sable pelts from Siberia exchanged hands for Flemish cloth and Frankish swords. Without this hub, the delicate balance of their northern routes collapsed. Riga's traders suddenly found themselves cut off from Russian wax supplies needed for candle-making guilds. Lübeck's furriers faced shortages that sent prices spiraling. Even the Steelyard in London felt the shockwaves. English wool merchants who'd relied on Hanseatic middlemen to reach Novgorod's markets now found their goods piling up unsold. The League's desperate attempts to salvage the situation only revealed their weakening grip. A delegation sent to Moscow in 1497 offered Ivan staggering concessions, lower tariffs, exclusive deals on Prussian grain, even a pledge to stop selling weapons to his Lithuanian enemies. But the Tsar, fresh from conquering Tver and Ryazan, had no interest in bargaining. His scribes recorded the negotiations with brutal brevity. The Germans pleaded like beggars. "We gave them nothing. For centuries, the Hanseatics had played kings against each other like chess pieces. Now they'd met a ruler who simply tipped over the board." Novgorod's fall exposed a deeper rot in the contour system. Just as Moscow grew stronger, so too did other monarchies. Denmark's Christian I had already seized Hanseatic assets in Bergen, while England's Henry VII chipped away at the Steelyard's privileges. These weren't isolated blows but symptoms of a new world order, where centralized states no longer tolerated semi-independent merchant republics within their borders. The contours, once cutting-edge hubs of globalization, now looked like relics wall by the dawn of the 1600s. The Baltic Sea was no longer the Hanseatic League's private pond. Cutting through the waves came sleek new vessels, Dutch flights with shallow drafts and cavernous holds, English merchantmen bristling with cannons, ships built for a faster, hungrier age of commerce. Where Hanseatic cogs plodded along familiar routes like stubborn oxen, these newcomers darted between ports like greyhounds, charging lower tariffs and promising quicker turnarounds. The League's once unshakable monopolies began cracking under a simple, brutal truth. They'd become the lumbering giants while these upstarts fought with the agility of pirates. The Dutch were the most dangerous competitors. Their flight ships, developed in the 1590s, were revolutionary, cheaper to build, needing half the crew of a Hanseatic cog, and able to slip into shallow coastal inlets where bulky German vessels dared not go. While the League still relied on designated staple ports, Dutch captains sold directly to smaller towns, undercutting fixed prices. A telling example, in 1602, a flight delivered Norwegian timber to Danzig for 18% less than the Hanseatic rate, then loaded Prussian grain for Amsterdam without paying the League's obligatory brokerage fees. This wasn't just competition, it was a wholesale rejection of the old rules. England's merchants brought a different kind of pressure. Backed by royal charters like the Muscovy Company, 1555, they bypassed Hanseatic middlemen entirely, sending their own ships straight to Russia for furs and wax. When the League tried to blockade London's trade with Novgorod in 1570, English privateers simply raided Hanseatic convoys, a tactic Elizabeth I tacitly approved by issuing letters of marque. The message was clear: the age of merchant empires playing by their own laws was ending. Nation-states with navies now called the shots. What made these challengers unstoppable wasn't just better ships or political backing, it was their willingness to embrace risk. Hanseatic trade moved at the glacial pace of consensus, with every guild and city council debating routes and prices. Dutch and English captains, often part owners of their vessels, could pivot on a tide. When the sound dues at Denmark spiked in 1620, Dutch merchants simply rerouted through the Arctic's deadly northeast passage, losing 3 ships to ice but breaking the League's stranglehold on Baltic access. Their ledgers treated such losses as business expenses, not catastrophes. The League's response veered between denial and desperation. Some cities, like Hamburg, adapted by quietly partnering with Dutch traders, a betrayal that fractured Hanseatic unity. Others doubled down on protectionism, urging the Holy Roman Emperor to ban foreign ships from German ports. The most telling humiliation came in 1643, when Denmark, once the League's vassal, signed exclusive toll deals with the Dutch, reducing Hanseatic cogs to second-class vessels in their home waters. Ironically, it was the League's own success that bred its obsolescence. By standardizing trade routes and stabilizing markets, they'd made the Baltic safe for rivals to thrive. The flights and merchantmen now dominating these waters were direct descendants of Hanseatic innovations, just leaner, meaner, and unburdened by centuries of tradition. The League hadn't lost because it grew weak, but because the world it built had outgrown its creators. The fatal crack in the Hanseatic League's armor wasn't carved by rival kings or pirates, it came from within. Take the bitter feud between Cologne and Danzig in the 1460s, a conflict so vicious it nearly tore the alliance apart. Cologne, long accustomed to dominating the Rhine trade, had grown fat on wine exports to England. But when Danzig's shipbuilders began undercutting their prices by sourcing cheaper timber from Lithuanian forests, Cologne's merchants didn't just protest, they weaponized the League's own rules. They pressured the Hanseatic Diet to impose punitive tariffs on Danzig's goods, claiming their eastern rival was flooding markets with shoddy lumber. Danzig retaliated by secretly funneling Prussian grain to Dutch traders, a blatant violation of the League's staple policies. What followed was a decade of backroom sabotage, Cologne's agents spreading rumors that Danzig's amber was cursed, Danzig's spies bribing London officials to reject Cologne's wine shipments. The feud reached its nadir in 1471 when a Cologne-backed privateer seized a Danzig cog carrying massed timber bound for England, an act of economic war between sister cities. This wasn't an isolated spat but a symptom of the League's original sin, its refusal to centralize. While rivals like Venice spoke with one voice through their doge, Hanseatic decisions required unanimous approval from 70-odd cities, a recipe for paralysis. Lübeck might demand a boycott of Norway, but Hamburg would quietly break ranks to preserve its herring profits. Bruges could vote to raise convoy fees, only to find Rostock's merchants striking side deals with Danish pirates. The system bred hypocrisy. Members loudly championed collective unity while carving out selfish exemptions. When the League needed funds to fight Denmark in 1410, wealthy cities like Lübeck and Hamburg paid their dues in silver, while smaller members contributed with promises of flax or tar that never materialized. The rot went deeper than finances. Each city guarded its privileges like dragons hoarding gold. In 1488, when Lübeck proposed creating a standing Hanseatic navy to combat Dutch competition, the motion died because coastal cities feared losing control of their ships. A decade later, attempts to standardize currency exchange rates collapsed as local mints refused to surrender their profits. Even something as basic as piracy patrols became mired in disputes should Hamburg's warships protect Bremen's cogs. Should Prussian cities pay to defend Baltic routes they rarely used? What made these divisions so lethal was their timing. Just as rising nation-states were unifying their trade policies under royal edicts, the League cities were pulling apart. England's Tudors could command London's merchants to boycott Hansa ports with a single proclamation, while the League wasted years debating whether to retaliate. When Dutch flights began dominating the Baltic in the 1500s, some Hanseatic cities wanted to lower tariffs to compete, while others demanded protectionist walls. The result, paralysis. Dutch ships carried 70% of Baltic grain by 1550, while Hanseatic cogs rotted at anchor, the ultimate irony. The League's greatest strength, its decentralized, cooperative model, became its death sentence in an age of mercantilism and centralized power. Like a rope unraveling strand by strand, the bonds between cities frayed until all that remained were hollow oaths and fading ledgers. By the time the last Hanseatic Diet convened in 1669, only 9 cities bothered to attend. They met not in Lübeck's Grand Guildhall, but in a cramped upstairs room, a fitting metaphor for an alliance that had once moved empires, now reduced to whisperers in the shadows. The final Hanseatic Diet in 1669 was less a meeting of powers and more a funeral no one wanted to attend. Lübeck's Grand Council chamber, where emperors and kings had once knelt before merchant princes, now echoed with the shuffling footsteps of just 9 delegates. The absent cities told the story. Hamburg was negotiating directly with the Dutch. Bremen had switched allegiance to Swedish protectors, and Danzig barely remembered it belonged to the League at all. The agenda itself was a ghost of past glories. Petty disputes over unpaid dues from decades-old convoys, a half-hearted petition to Denmark about sound toll abuses, and a request to Lübeck's archivists to preserve certain records of historical interest. No bold decrees, no coordinated boycotts, just the administrative whimper of an alliance that had outlived its time. What made this gathering so tragic wasn't the lack of decisions, but the lack of defiance. When Lübeck's burgomaster Johann Ritter proposed one last naval alliance against French privateers, the delegates from Braunschweig and Goslar excused themselves to consult their town councils, a hollow formality everyone understood meant never. The delegate from Cologne didn't even bother attending in person, sending a junior clerk who spent the sessions doodling in the margins of the minutes. Even the meeting's location spoke volumes, held not in the ornate Guildhall where the League had once humbled kings, but in a nondescript upstairs room normally used for auditing wine taxes. The real death knell came when the discussion turned to finances. For centuries, the League's war chest had been legendary, a mythical hoard of silver that could raise fleets and bribe emperors. Now, Lübeck's treasurer revealed the truth. The once bottomless vaults held barely enough to pay the scribe recording these very minutes. Cities that owed back payments shrugged. Rostock's representative actually laughed when asked about their 12,000 mark debt from the Danish Wars 2 centuries prior. The ledger books, once meticulously kept in iron-bound chests, now showed entries like 1648 Antwerp boycott expenses, unpaid by 23 cities. Yet amid the ruin, there were glimpses of what had been. When old documents were brought out, the Treaty of Stralsund from 1370, the Visby Agreements yellowed with age, the delegates still reached instinctively for their merchant seals before remembering such gestures no longer mattered. The final vote to suspend indefinite further assemblies passed without opposition, but not without one last flicker of Hanseatic pride. The delegate from tiny Hildesheim, whose city had joined late and contributed little, suddenly stood and recited the old oath in crackling Low German. We pledge goods, ships, and silver to the common need. The others joined the final line in uneasy unison. So long as the tides bear us. Then they walked out into a world where the tides now bore Dutch flights and English men of war, leaving Lübeck's archives to swallow the last parchment of an empire built on ledgers. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph came not from the delegates, but from a Swedish diplomat writing home that winter. The Hansa dies as it lived, he noted, not with swords or crowns, but with bookkeepers arguing over debts older than their grandfathers. The League's greatest achievement, turning commerce into power, had become its undoing, for the nation-states learned its lessons too well. Amsterdam, London, and Stockholm now played the game with navies and royal charters, leaving no room for a whispered alliance of pepper sack merchants. The tides still rose and fell, but they no longer bore the Hanseatic dream. Buried in the fine print of modern shipping contracts and international trade agreements lies an invisible inheritance, the ghostly hand of Hanseatic law. Centuries before phrases like free trade zone or most favored nation status entered diplomatic lexicons, the League was quietly codifying principles that still underpin global commerce. Take their concept of market peace, a radical idea that transformed chaotic medieval fairs into predictable economic engines. In bustling contours from Bruges to Novgorod, this meant designated zones where violence was forbidden, debts couldn't be settled with swords, and disputes went before merchant juries instead of feudal courts. Sound familiar? Today's bonded warehouses and arbitration clauses descend directly from these 14th century innovations, proving that security breeds prosperity. The League's obsession with standardization birthed other enduring legacies. Their staple right, the rule forcing certain goods to be unloaded and offered for sale at designated ports, evolved into modern customs procedures. When a container shipped today docks in Rotterdam and undergoes mandatory inspections before goods disperse across Europe, it's following a script the Hanseatics wrote. Even something as mundane as the bill of lading, that ubiquitous document tracking cargo ownership from factory to store shelf, traces its lineage to Lübeck's wax-sealed waybills. Archaeologists excavating Hanseatic sites still find wooden tally sticks notched with transaction records, medieval blockchain encoding trust in physical form. Maritime law owes perhaps the deepest debt. The League's convoy rules, which apportioned liability when storms or pirates struck, became the foundation for general average, the principle that all parties sharing a voyage share its losses. When a modern cargo ship jettisons containers to save the vessel, and insurers prorate the costs among stakeholders, they're invoking a system Hanseatic skippers devised to keep trade flowing through Viking-infested waters. Their wreck law, granting salvagers a percentage of recovered goods rather than feudal lords claiming everything, still echoes in admiralty courts from Singapore to Hamburg. Perhaps most strikingly, the League anticipated corporate liability. In 1421, when a rogue Hanseatic captain sold arms to Lithuania despite an embargo, the entire contour in Novgorod was fined, establishing that collective entities bear responsibility for individual actions. Modern holding companies wrestling with subsidiary misconduct are grappling with a precedent set by fur traders 600 years ago. Even intellectual property protections have Hanseatic roots. Their guilds fiercely guarded craft secrets, with penalties for revealing linen weaving techniques or barrel-making methods that foreshadow today's patent litigation. Yet the true test of these laws isn't in dusty statutes, but in their stubborn persistence. Walk the docks of modern Gdansk, where cranes unload shipping containers instead of timber-laden cogs, and you'll hear stevedores joking about Hanseatic hours, their term for working dawn till dusk, a rhythm set when the League mandated uniform port operating times. In London's financial district, commodities traders still speak of stapling contracts to specific exchanges, unaware they're channeling medieval merchants who demanded Prussian grain pass through Danzig. The League's greatest triumph wasn't dominating trade for 3 centuries, but embedding its logic so deeply that the world forgot there was ever another way. Their laws didn't just regulate commerce, they invented the very grammar of globalization, teaching civilizations to speak the language of trust across distance and difference. Standing before Lübeck's Holstentor Gate, with its twin brick towers leaning defiantly inward like a merchant crossing arms, you're face to face with the Hanseatic League's architectural manifesto. This isn't just a city gate, it's a billboard in red brick and glazed black tile, announcing to every arriving trader that behind these walls commerce ruled. The Hanseatic Gothic style that swept across the Baltic wasn't about soaring cathedrals or delicate stained glass. It was power dressing in mortar and stone, thick walls to withstand sieges, stepped gables displaying wealth like a fur-lined ledger, and those signature spires visible from seaward, functioning as lighthouse and flex combined. Walk through Tallinn's old town and the language repeats itself. The Great Guild Hall's cavernous cellar, where merchants once stored amber and wax, boasts vaulted ceilings supported by squat, muscular pillars. No flying buttresses here. These were load-bearing columns designed to hold up not just roofs, but the weight of stacked trade goods. Even the decorative touches served practical ends. The intricate stepped gables on Bergen's Briggen Wharf weren't just pretty. Their staggered design allowed hoists to lift cargo directly from ships to attic warehouses without cluttering narrow streets. This was architecture as business infrastructure, every flourish calibrated for profit. The secret weapon, brick. While southern Europe built with quarried stone, the Baltic's lack of natural stone deposits forced innovation. Local clay, baked into durable bricks and often glazed for weather resistance, became the League's signature material. But these weren't just any bricks. Hanseatic masons developed a standardized format, measuring roughly 28 by 14 by 9 centimeters, allowing construction crews from Riga to Bruges to work from identical plans. Churches like Stralsund's Nikolaikerk showcase the ingenious variations. Dark glazed bricks forming geometric patterns that required no fragile stone carvings, and alternating red and black layers creating stripes that announced Hanseatic affiliation like a corporate logo. Inside these structures, light became a currency. Compare Lübeck's Rathaus with its wall of tall, narrow windows to a typical feudal castle's arrow slits. Where nobles designed for defense, merchants prioritized visibility, both literal and metaphorical. The Rathaus's white-plastered council chamber, flooded with light from 3-story windows, was a stage for transparent deal-making, or at least the illusion of it. Even churches doubled as trade halls. Rostock's Marienkirche housed not just altars but notary booths where contracts were signed under watchful saints. The true masterstroke of Hanseatic architecture was its portability. When a new city joined the League, it didn't just adopt laws, it imported builders. Foundations in Gdansk reveal bricks stamped with Lübeck masons' marks, identical to those found 700 kilometers west. Bergen's Hanseatic Museum preserves wooden modules prefabricated in Germany and shipped for assembly like medieval flat-pack furniture. This wasn't cultural imperialism, it was branding. A merchant stepping ashore in Rival, modern Tallinn, could navigate streets mirroring Lübeck's layout, find his guild hall in the expected position near the square, and even relieve himself in public latrines built to the same specifications, a comforting predictability in an alien land. Yet for all its uniformity, local flavors seeped in. Visit Torun's leaning town hall, and you'll spot Polish floral motifs sneaking into brickwork patterns. Tallinn's Olaus Church stretches the Hanseatic template vertically, its spire stretching 159 meters skyward, a nod to Estonian folk beliefs about reaching closer to the heavens. Even the Holstentor's famous lean, over a meter off vertical, whispers of adaptation, its foundations sinking into the marshy Trav riverbank just as the League itself eventually sank into time's mud. What survives today isn't just picturesque old towns for tourists. That signature combination of vaulted warehouses, wide market squares, and guild halls with overhanging upper floors became the DNA of Northern European urbanism. When fire ravaged Riga in 1577, it was rebuilt not with wooden hovels but in enduring Hanseatic brick, creating the Art Nouveau wonderland you see today. Modern zoning laws in Hamburg still enforce Dielenhäuser designs, narrow frontages with deep storage spaces inherited from medieval merchant plots. The League's buildings outlasted its treaties because they weren't just containers for trade. They were stone and mortar embodiments of an idea that efficiency, community, and ambition could be etched into the very streets we walk. The red and white flag snapping in the wind above Lübeck's Holstentor Gate isn't just a historical artifact, it's a living symbol of a medieval superpower that refused to fade into the past. In 1980, exactly 7 centuries after the League's first recorded diet, mayors from 12 European cities gathered in the same guild hall where their merchant ancestors once plotted trade wars. Their mission, to resurrect the Hanseatic spirit not as an economic cartel, but as a cultural torch passed between ports that still bore the architectural scars and genetic memory of that golden age. What began as a nostalgic handshake has become a transnational phenomenon. The new Hanseatic League, a network of nearly 200 cities from Russia to Portugal, all leveraging shared history to shape their futures. Bremen offers a masterclass in this modern reinvention. Walk its Schnorr Quarter today, and you'll find 16th-century warehouses reborn as artisan chocolate shops, their stepped gables now framing Instagram backdrops rather than stacks of Flemish cloth. The city's tourism board didn't just preserve these buildings, they weaponized them, creating Hanseatic walking trails where visitors follow brass gull motifs embedded in cobblestones, the League's ancient symbol for trade winds. Local brewers even revived Hans Pils, a beer based on yeast strains extracted from centuries-old shipwrecked barrels. We're not just selling history, says Bremen's heritage director Anke Muhrenberg in a clipped low German accent. We're selling belonging, the idea that a Portuguese tourist in Tallinn can spot our gabled roofs and think, this feels like home. Historians trace this revival's roots to the Cold War's thaw. As the Iron Curtain rusted, cities like Rostock and Gdansk, once severed by ideology, rediscovered their shared Hanseatic DNA. Academic conferences in the 1990s became trading zones for medieval recipes rather than spices, with Lithuanian archivists swapping parchment scans with Dutch researchers. The real turning point came in 2009 when the EU funded Hans Sail, an annual flotilla where replica cogs now dock beside cruise ships in Rostock's harbour. It's theatre, yes, admits maritime historian Lars Olvers, but theatre that reminds us these waters were Europe's first free trade zone long before Brussels existed. The League's afterlife isn't confined to tourism. In Tallinn, tech startups brand themselves with Hanseatic crests, framing Estonia's digital revolution as a spiritual successor to medieval trade innovation. Dutch energy firms invoke the Hanseatic Green Deal, using the League's old routes to plot offshore wind farms. Even Brexit negotiations saw German diplomats float a neo-Hanseatic alliance of northern European states, proof that the old mercantile instincts still lurk beneath modern geopolitics. Yet the revival's most poignant chapter unfolds in Novgorod. Once the easternmost Hanseatic outpost, the city spent decades scrubbing away its German past under Soviet rule. Now restorers carefully peel back Stalinist plaster to reveal Gothic brickwork, while schoolchildren reenact medieval trade fairs with replica scales and wax-sealed contracts. For us, this isn't about nostalgia, insists local historian Irina Golubkova, her hands stained with archive dust. It's about reclaiming a time when Novgorod was a bridge between worlds, not a border. The new Hanseatic League will never command economies like its predecessor, but in an age of faceless globalization, its cities offer something potent, tangible roots. When a Dutch tourist traces her finger over Lübeck's ancient Schusselbuden fish auction records, or a Polish chef sources smoked herring using a 14th century Hanseatic recipe, they're not just observing history, they're stepping into its current. The League's true legacy was never its ledger books or warships, but its radical notion that identity could flow as freely as goods across open seas. 600 years later, that idea still sails on. Scholars still sharpen their quills, or more likely, their keyboards over the Hanseatic League's true place in history. Was it a capitalist pioneer blazing trails for modern commerce, or just a feudal wolf in merchant's clothing? The debate splits academia like a poorly balanced ledger. On one side stand historians like Fritz Röhrig, who dubbed the League the first international corporation, pointing to its profit-driven networks that ignored borders long before modern multinationals. They highlight innovations like bills of exchange and maritime insurance, financial tools so advanced they wouldn't look out of place in a Wall Street firm today. The League's very structure, with cities as shareholders voting by trade volume, seems ripped from a venture capital playbook, but peel back the veneer and another story emerges. Marxist scholar Philippe Dollinger argued the League was ultimately a feudal relic, its wealth forever tied to land-based power, those famed merchant princes. Many were nobles in disguise, using trade profits to buy feudal titles. The contours might have operated like modern free zones, but they relied on medieval privileges, royal charters granting tax exemptions, not open market competition. Even the League's famed monopolies smacked of old-world restriction, not free enterprise. When they blocked Dutch ships from Baltic ports or strong-armed Norway into exclusive deals, was this capitalism, or just territorialism with a balance sheet? The truth likely bobs somewhere between these poles, like a cog navigating the Øresund's tricky currents. Consider Lübeck's labor laws. While they championed contract freedom, a capitalist ideal, they also enforced guild restrictions that would make a modern CEO balk. Or take the League's relationship with risk. They pioneered insurance pools yet shunned speculative ventures, preferring safe staples like grain and timber over high-risk, high-reward spices. This wasn't pure capitalism but a transitional hybrid, grafting new economic shoots onto feudal roots. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in the League's decline. When true capitalist players, the Dutch and English, rose with flexible, shareholder-funded joint stock companies, the Hanseatic cities clung to consensus-driven guild models. Their insistence on unanimous decisions, once a strength, became an anchor in the fast-changing seas of early modern trade. The League didn't fail because it was too feudal, it failed because it wasn't capitalist enough. Yet its legacy whispers through modern trade law, maritime insurance, and even EU regulations, proof that history's most enduring innovations often bloom in the messy soil between eras. Beneath the Baltic's icy waves and buried in the North Sea's shifting sands lie the Hanseatic League's most enduring secret shipwrecks packed with lost fortunes and untold stories. Historians estimate over 3,000 cogs and hulks sank during the League's reign, their hulls stuffed with Prussian amber, Novgorod furs, and ingots of Saxony silver. Yet fewer than 50 wrecks have ever been found. The legendary Christoph von Lübeck, a floating warehouse lost in 1488 carrying an entire season's worth of Riga flax, hasn't been glimpsed since it vanished near Gotland. Even more tantalizing is the Goldene Rose, a Hamburg merchantman reportedly transporting 3 tons of gold, the ransom for a French prince when it disappeared off Norway in 1422. Modern sonar scans have revealed ghostly shapes near the Dogger Bank that could be Hanseatic traders, their oak timbers preserved by cold water and thick layers of sediment. But the Baltic guards its prizes jealously. Shifting currents and centuries of accumulated silt make these wrecks far more elusive than Mediterranean galleys. The League's organizational secrets prove just as puzzling. Why did this hyper-efficient network never evolve into a formal state? Most medieval powers centralized. Venice had its Doge, the Teutonic Knights their Grand Master, yet the Hanseatic cities clung to a loose alliance. The answer lies in their mercantile DNA. Centralization meant taxes, standing armies, and fixed borders, all anathema to traders who thrived on flexibility. When Lübeck proposed creating a unified Hanseatic treasury in 1450, Hamburg and Bremen revolted, fearing it would morph into a tax-collecting monstrosity. The League's strength was its distributed nature. When war closed the Øresund Strait, ships simply rerouted through the Elbe. No capital meant no single point of failure. Archaeologists now chase tantalizing clues that could rewrite Hanseatic history. In 2018, dendrochronologists studying Denmark's Bredfjord shipwreck matched its oak timbers to timber yards in Lübeck, proving the League's standardized shipbuilding reached further than previously thought. Ground-penetrating radar in Visby has revealed cellars beneath the old German quarter filled with unopened barrels, possibly containing herring tax records or merchants' last wills. Most electrifying is the recent discovery of a 14th-century cipher book in Tallinn's archives, its pages filled with coded trade routes and payments that may finally reveal how the League balanced its books across 70 cities. The greatest mystery isn't what we've lost, but what we might still find. Climate change is melting permafrost in Novgorod, potentially exposing the Peterhof's original warehouse logs. Advances in DNA analysis could trace the origins of barrels found in wrecks, revealing previously unknown trade links. And somewhere in a musty Hamburg attic, there may still lie a forgotten chest, one holding the League's missing ledger books, waiting to whisper their secrets after 6 centuries of silence. The Hanseatic League built its empire on calculated risks and carefully guarded knowledge. Perhaps its final gift will be reminding us that history is never truly settled, only waiting for the right moment to surface. The rise and fall of the Hanseatic League offers more than just medieval history. It's a playbook for modern trade wars, tariffs, and globalization. Consider the uncanny resemblance between the League's staple ports and today's special economic zones. Just as Hanseatic merchants demanded exclusive trading hubs in Bruges and Novgorod, modern corporations negotiate tax havens and deregulated free ports from Singapore to Dubai. Both systems promise mutual prosperity, but with the same underlying tension: who really controls the rules? When the League strong-armed Norway into lowering tariffs in 1284, it wasn't so different from modern trade blocs imposing conditions on developing nations. The weapons have changed. Instead of embargoes, we now have sanctions, but the game remains eerily familiar. Yet the League's greatest lesson lies in its contradictions. It preached free trade while enforcing brutal monopolies, much like how today's superpowers champion open markets while subsidizing domestic industries. Take the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, a system of farm subsidies that would feel right at home in the Hanseatic playbook, where Lübeck's grain merchants lobbied for protections against cheaper Polish competitors. Even the League's decentralized structure finds echoes in modern trade alliances. The EU's struggle to balance German industrial interests with Mediterranean agricultural needs mirrors the Hanseatic cities squabbling over convoy fees and tariff splits. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. Where the League's experience becomes truly instructive is in its blind spots. Its downfall came not from external enemies, but from an inability to adapt when nation-states consolidated power. Today's trade organizations face a similar crossroads. Geopolitical tensions and rising nationalism are testing institutions like the WTO, just as Tudor England and Muscovite Russia once undermined the contour system. The League's fatal error was assuming economic interdependence alone could prevent conflict. Sound familiar? Modern globalization's cheerleaders might note how quickly Russian gas pipelines and Chinese manufacturing hubs became geopolitical liabilities when diplomacy failed. But perhaps the most relevant parallel is cultural. The League didn't just move goods, it created a shared identity across linguistic and ethnic divides. Modern trade blocs attempt something similar with Erasmus exchanges and cross-border education programs, yet struggle to replicate that visceral sense of belonging. Walk through Tallinn today, and you'll still find cafes serving Lübeck-style marzipan alongside Estonian black bread, a delicious reminder that lasting integration happens through daily life, not just treaties. The new Hanseatic League's cultural revival suggests people still crave these connections, even in an age of digital commerce. The cautionary tale: systems built solely on profit eventually crumble. The League flourished when it balanced ledgers with loyalty, then faltered when narrower interests prevailed. As today's trade architects design digital customs unions and blockchain supply chains, they do well to remember that the longest-lasting medieval contracts weren't signed in ink, but in trust. And that's the fragile commodity no algorithm can replicate. From the humble docks of 13th century Lübeck to the marble halls of Renaissance power brokers, the Hanseatic League's 500-year reign defies simple categorization. What began as a loose alliance of fish traders pooling ships to outrun pirates evolved into something far more revolutionary, a blueprint for how commerce could rewrite the rules of power without firing a single arrow. Picture the arc: fishermen haggling over salted herring barrels on Gotland's windswept shores. Then fast forward 3 centuries to merchant princes dictating terms to kings at the Treaty of Stralsund. The League didn't just dominate trade routes, it weaponized them, turning wool and wax into levers that could topple thrones. Yet its true innovation wasn't in the goods it moved, but in the systems it invented along the way: standardized contracts, maritime insurance, even early trade embargoes, tools so effective they became the hidden wiring of modern globalization. But here's the twist: the League's legacy isn't confined to history books. Scroll through today's supply chain dashboards or digital payment platforms, and you'll spot eerie echoes of Hanseatic ingenuity. Amazon's fulfillment centers, a high-tech version of the staple ports that forced goods through designated hubs, cryptocurrencies, decentralized ledgers. Not so different from the League's network trust system, where a merchant's word in Bruges could unlock credit in Novgorod. Even modern trade wars play out with Hanseatic logic. Sanctions replacing blockades, algorithms calculating tariffs instead of guild scribes. The players have changed, but the game remains startlingly familiar. Which begs a provocative question. In our age of instant digital trade and invisible supply chains, have we all become unwitting Hanseatics? When you tap an app to order goods shipped across continents, or when your pension fund invests in overseas markets, you're participating in a system those medieval merchants would recognize, just with fewer pirates and more server farms. The League's greatest trick was making their structures so indispensable that the world forgot they were ever novel. Now, as data flows replace Baltic currents and our brokers outpace human middlemen, we're left to wonder, are we building the next iteration of their vision or merely repeating its blind spots? Drop your take in the comments. Was the Hanseatic League history's first tech disruptors, or just another cartel dressed in Gothic brick? And while you're at it, consider this: 5 centuries from now, what remnants of our digital age will archaeologists uncover as proof that we, too, once rewrote the rules? The ghost ports of the Baltic whisper that empires rise and fall, but trade always finds a way.